This is episode 361 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is supported by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here and access insider content, including visual history that accompanies the audio of our podcast. Learn more at patreon.com/That Shakespeare Life and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm David Crystal. I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Bangor in Wales in the UK, and the author of various books like the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language and a fair amount on Shakespeare too. Another great method for studying the history of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my good friend, Cassidy Cash.
As far as I know, that the speculation that she wasn't literate, and it's not an implausible idea, comes from the fact that certain legal documents that she signed, she didn't sign them with her name, and she made some kind of mark instead.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
The last time we talked about Judith Quiney was to discuss her youth as the younger sister of Susanna Shakespeare, the twin of Hamnet, and the overall black sheep of her famous family due to her husband's excommunication and the marriage scandal causing her father, William Shakespeare, to rewrite his will to exclude Judith and her husband, Thomas. The details of Judith Quiney's life are as sparse as they are tantalizing, and historical fiction has jumped on the opportunity to try and piece together the fragments. We welcome one such writer this week, Grace Tiffany, having just completed her second book on Judith Quiney that offers a fictionalized rendering of what was possible for Judith Shakespeare in the second half of her life, where she not only far outlived her scandalous youth, but she lived far beyond the life of her famous father, dying at the old age of 77 in 1662, close to 50 years after the death of Shakespeare himself. Grace Tiffany is a successful novelist, author, and professor of Shakespeare at Western Michigan University. Her first novel, My Father Had a Daughter, was published in 2003 and is a fictional tale about the life of Shakespeare's second daughter, Judith. Her latest book, The Owl Was a Baker's Daughter, builds on the historical facts about the life of Judith Shakespeare Quiney, dramatizing a fictional reality for Judith based on the noble history of a mysterious life. In addition to her novels, Grace has received numerous awards for her research into Shakespeare history and her notable fiction work. She has written scholarly articles and monographs on Renaissance history and culture, with her work appearing in Shakespeare Studies, Texas Studies in Literature and Language, and the Renaissance Quarterly, among others. James Shapiro, the celebrated Shakespearean author and one of the foremost Shakespeareans of our time, has called Grace's book, The Turquoise Ring, one of the 6 best creative adaptations of Shakespeare in history. You can learn more about Grace Tiffany, her books, and where you can read them, all in the show notes for today's episode. Before we dive into our conversation today, I want to let you know that there's coordinating visual history that goes along with our podcast, all about Judith Shakespeare Quiney, including primary documents, modern artist renderings of what she might have looked like, and other research tidbits that are available as bonus content for patrons of our show. If you'd like to explore this content while you're listening today, you can use the Patreon button on our show notes page at CassidyCash.com/episode 361. That's CassidyCash.com/EP361, and that will expand all of these extras while you listen to the show. And now let's dive into the history. Hello, Grace. Welcome back to That Shakespeare Life. So nice to have you here again.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me back.
I think we should clarify right away that the famous Quiney scandal, where Judith's husband was excommunicated, happened in March of 1616, just a month before William Shakespeare died. We talk more about that event in our first episode with Grace that I will link you to in the show notes for today. But Grace, let's pick up where we left off with Judith. After this event, she was obviously removed from the church, but not permanently, since there are records of her children being baptized in the church later in November of that same year. And that begs the question, how serious was this episode of excommunication? And did Judith stay and live in Stratford-upon-Avon after her marriage?
Well, just to clarify first that we're talking about the actual historical Judith Shakespeare here because I do take certain liberties in my fictionalized version of her. But I think from as far as we can tell that her and her husband's temporary excommunication from the church was kind of a run-of-the-mill sort of thing that had to do with filing dates for their marriage license. And it probably wasn't that unusual. They were the English church doesn't do excommunications anymore, but apparently they still had that tradition. So it was a matter of a few weeks of not being in the good books of the church. And then the matter was rectified. But there was a different event that was actually more scandalous involving Thomas Quiney that occurred later and that wasn't related to that excommunication. And he wasn't excommunicated for this, but he was found guilty of sexual immorality by something called the Body Court, which was an ecclesiastical court that investigated, kind of a busybody court that investigated people's morals. And he apparently, right around the time of his marriage, was found guilty of having impregnated another woman and forced to do a public, well, not forced, but, kind of strongly required to do a public penitence for this. And so that would have been something of a scandal, at least an embarrassment to Judith. This is the man that she just married, probably didn't make the Shakespeare family too happy, although they were good friends with the Quiney family, the family of the groom, Thomas Quiney. So that happened, blew over or didn't. We don't really know a lot about Judith's reaction to it. She can't have been happy about it, but there's no reason to think that she didn't continue living with him. They had children afterward. They lived in Stratford for, decades of married life. And we can only speculate on whatever kind of lingering reputational issues accrued from that incident.
I mean, we do know that Shakespeare changes his will to essentially exclude Judith and Thomas Quiney from receiving an inheritance that by custom was, set to go to them. It was almost a provision he had to write in there specifically, I do not want this to go to Judith and Thomas. And I think we point to the excommunication, but it sounds like Thomas had a lot of things going on in his life that made him a questionable figure that might have played into Shakespeare's decision to say, I don't want them responsible for my property once I'm gone.
Well, it wasn't exactly rewritten in that way. He did alter his will with regard to Judith and her husband shortly before he died. But what he did was to cross out Thomas Quiney's name. He had been going to make a separate behest to him, or a behest to the couple, but in the name of Thomas. And he crossed out Thomas Quiney's name and he put Judith's name in. So what he was actually doing was apparently protecting Judith financially in the event of whatever. We don't know, abandonment by Thomas, the death of Thomas. We don't know the reasons for it. It happened right before he died. It happened right around the same time as these kind of public humiliations were going on. And so it's easy to speculate that William Shakespeare had or acquired certain doubts about Thomas's character. And actually, he wanted to put his daughter on a safer financial footing. In my novel, I take certain liberties with my representation of the life of this couple. I have it a somewhat different way. And in my story, your account is more true. I mean, it's fictionally true that he limits and doesn't absolutely cut them out, but seriously limits the amount that either one of them is to inherit. And in my fictional representation of Judith, I have reasons for that. I have, certain psychological reasons that have to do with Judith's character, with her relationship with her father, and with his insight into her character and his comparing of her with her sister with regard to money. So I invent certain reasons for that. But the truth is, like so many things involving Shakespeare's family, we have this kind of sparse written record that just shows up in legal documents and legal decisions concerning them. And then all we can do is speculate about what was likely going on and what the reasons for it were. That's what fiction is for. Then we can invent all these reasons.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the old adage is to understand somebody, you have to walk a mile in their shoes. And with historical figures, even when you have a wealth of historical knowledge about someone, it's hard to know those fine details of what their personal journey really was. And fiction is a great place to fill in the gaps for someone like Judith Quiney, whose life is so fascinating, but so missing in some of these details we would love to have. And I think we can say fairly that her young life gets a rocky start. At least her married life definitely gets a rocky start. But despite this scandal, she does go on to have several children with Thomas Quiney. So I want to ask about what happens afterwards. Does she recover her reputation after Shakespeare dies, or does Judith live the rest of her life kind of tainted from these events?
Well, we can't know that at all from the historical record. I don't think there's any reason to think that her reputation was tainted by this. I mean, because it was her husband's deal, and he was the one who had to submit to this public penance in front of the congregation of Holy Trinity Church. And while that must have been embarrassing for her, I don't think it cast aspersions or doubts on her own character. So I would assume that things like this happened to other people in Stratford as well. I mean, the body court was kind of a busy court, and was getting into people's business, and so it may not have been as huge a thing as we think. And we know about her just because we're so interested in Shakespeare that we kind of dig up every little fact we can find out about Shakespeare's family. But apparently they lived on in Stratford. They had children together. Thomas was a tradesman. I think at one point he was actually a bailiff, so that there wasn't any permanent damage to their standing in the town. In my version of Judith, she does have a kind of reputation for eccentricity that dates back to way before she marries Thomas and has to do with her behavior in youth and certain scandalous adventures that she goes on in her own right. And this is completely fabricated by me. I can just say that. I mean, it's like you're kind of happy when you find an interesting historical figure or a figure from an interesting historically interesting family that there isn't a lot known about, because then you can create this fictional possibility for her.
I think the historical record does kind of support it's not implausible to think that she was an eccentric figure. I mean, I think, isn't she distinct from Susanna in the fact that I don't think Judith was literate, whereas Susanna was. There's some historical records that bring that into question. Let's say that's not a definitive definition of her, but I was thinking there were some documents that suggested Judith maybe didn't have the education that Susanna had.
As far as I know, that the speculation that she wasn't literate, and it's not an implausible idea, comes from the fact that certain legal documents that she signed, she didn't sign them with her name, and she made some kind of mark instead. So I think it kind of makes sense to infer from that okay, maybe she didn't know how to. That really does seem strange to not be able to write your name, especially if you're Shakespeare's daughter.
It was surprising to me. I expected his kids to have a baseline for sure.
Yeah, reasonable interest in literature if you're Shakespeare's daughter. So we don't know. But that's such a slim thing to base a biography on. And certainly in my version of her, she's not illiterate. She's full of imaginative fancy that's born out of things that she reads. She's very much her father's daughter. And that may well have been the case. I think she's kind of a blank. I mean, in my first novel about her, the title of that, My Father Had a Daughter, which is the story of Shakespeare in her youth, that's drawn from that passage in Twelfth Night where Viola is talking to Orsino, and Orsino asks about her history. And Viola, who's in disguise, she says her history is a blank. It's a blank. My father had a daughter, but her history is a blank. And I think it kind of is. That's intriguing. And I like to think that she was an interesting and odd and eccentric character. I agree with you that it's not unlikely that she was, partly because she was Shakespeare's daughter. And that must mean something. I think Susanna is interesting too, in a different way. We know more about Susanna, her older sister, but she seems like a good person, a likely person to speculate that she had much of the imaginative eccentricity of her father. And so that's what I tried to do with her character.
I almost hate to continue evaluating Judith in the shadow of Susanna, but as a sister myself, I think I would not. I have to feel that Judith would be like, stop doing that to me. But I want to ask it this way anyway, because we do have more information about Susanna than Judith. And one of the things that I'm wondering is whether or not Judith had a relationship with Susanna as an adult. For contrast's sake here, I know the Queen of Spain, for example, visited Susanna Shakespeare in Stratford, and we have a historical record of this happening. But we don't have any historical record of Judith being involved in that, and that's surprising to me. Do you think that from what you've researched about Judith's life, that this would have been something is it odd that she's not mentioned as being a part of this pretty significant event?
Well, it actually wasn't the Queen of Spain who visited Susanna. It was Queen Henrietta Maria of England. I think that's probably what you're referring to.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. She was the Queen of Charles I. So she was the Queen of England, which is also still a pretty big deal. The Queen of England.
I would think so. Yes. The Queen of anywhere visiting your house is a big deal.
Right. Yeah. Sojourning at your family home. So we have a record of that visit, which we have because we have a record of state visits. But again, I mean, we would love to have some kind of letter or diary entry, some kind of local account or personal account of the event as it affected the Shakespeare family, and we don't. So it might be that other members of the Shakespeare family were involved in this occasion, were invited to be there. In my novel, I have Judith allude to it. And the truth is like, I don't really know if she was there or not, according to my fictional version of her, like whether even in that fictional world she was there or not. She talks about it kind of witheringly as the type of thing that would make her older sister feel puffed up and proud, and that was meaningful to her. And there's kind of an implication that it's like not Judith's kind of thing. She doesn't care if Queen Henrietta Maria comes and graces the family with her presence. But there's just a kind of brief allusion to it. But as far as your kind of larger question of what was the relationship between Judith and Susanna, again, we don't have a lot of actual historical information about that either. But I like to speculate, and I do sort of suggest in these works of fiction that there's a real temperamental difference between them, and that Susanna actually is not just the person who ended up with the wealth of the family or the greater part of it, but is the person to whom that was important, the person who liked to spend money, the person who was more materialistic. Whereas Judith, as the younger daughter, or not necessarily because she's the younger daughter, but just, she happens maybe partly out of a certain kind of rebelliousness to just be a wild woman, kind of a weirdo. And so she's out in the woods picking herbs and practicing experiments and things like that. The way I paint these two sisters is that they have a kind of lifelong sisterly rivalry based on position in the household, differences between them, character differences between them. But also in this second book, I like to think that I suggest that there is more to Susanna than Judith ever really understood. And that in their old age, because they're both older, they're both in their 60s, in this phase of the story, they come to a kind of understanding and friendship that was not available to them in their youth.
Grace writes in her book that John Hall, Susanna Shakespeare's husband, trained Judith in the Paracelsian healing arts. Grace, what I love about your books is that while you are fictionalizing a lot of what we don't know about these characters, you are basing your fiction in a lot of historical research. So I want to ask about this part of your story. Do we know whether or not Judith Quiney would have worked with John Hall in real life, even though her husband, Thomas, was a vintner and a tobacconist? And so I'm curious why you didn't take her on the route of assisting her own husband. What about her story that we can know had you take her in this direction?
Well, the part that's very much true is that John Hall, the physician who was married to Susanna, and so was Judith's brother-in-law, was a Paracelsian healer, which is a branch of medicine kind of popular in the early 17th century, late 16th century, that involved minerals and various kind of things that we probably think are somewhat dangerous today, but it was kind of this philosophical approach to healing with natural substances. And the part that I invented was that Judith, again, as a young woman, so even before her marriage to Thomas Quiney, develops an interest in those processes and that practice, and also needs something to do because she's just this restless spirit. And so she becomes an assistant and eventually becomes very well practiced in healing arts and even in more traditional modes of medicine, and she's a midwife. And so that wouldn't have been all that unusual, for a country town. And then she just keeps up that practice and brings in money that way. Her husband, Thomas, and this part is true, he was a vintner. That means he sold wines. And in reality, it's quite likely that the actual Judith Shakespeare, the historical Judith Shakespeare, helped him with that in some capacity, worked in his shop. And so there's a divergence there between what I do with her. I mean, I guess we don't know that she wasn't a surgeon and midwife, but that's not based on historical evidence apart from the fact of her having had a brother-in-law who was an important physician in the town. It's more based on the psychology of the character that I created in the first novel and then continued in the second one.
Grace's book shows Judith Shakespeare fleeing Stratford-upon-Avon on the charges of witchcraft. Explain for us whether or not this part of Judith's story was based in actual fact. Was the real Judith Shakespeare ever accused of witchcraft that we know of?
Well, we don't know that she wasn't. It could have been. It's like that's what's helpful if your history is a blank. But I hate to keep confessing to things that I invented. But that's pretty much partly a device to get her out of Stratford and to bring her on another adventure as she goes south to London again. And so much of the story takes place then in this parliamentary controlled Puritan London, because this story takes place during the time of English Civil War, the war between the parliamentarians and their army, Oliver Cromwell leading it, and the royalists. And so she finds herself caught up in that situation, but also in this personal danger where there's an incident that kind of starts everything off when she makes a midwife call to deliver a child. And she brings with her these rather strange companions that she's taken into her household, including a very unusual child who become her assistants. And something happens during the process of what should have been just a routine child delivery that brings suspicion down on the Shakespeare household and endangers her with this charge of possible witchcraft. And so they flee in order to prevent that from causing all kinds of trouble for her. So then she gets to London and encounters other adventures, some of them political, some of them theatrical, when she's there. So this is a product of my imagination, but the English Civil War is not a product of my imagination. The closing of the theaters, that is part of the context for the situation that she finds herself in. When she gets to London, she encounters an old friend of hers, an old player who people will remember from the prior novel if they've read the prior novel, which, by the way, you don't have to have read the prior novel to understand what's going on in this one. But a player who's somewhat out of work because of this new puritanical reformed temper of the country, which is very down on public entertainments. And so this real historical political situation then becomes the context for this new adventure that she finds herself in the middle of with this old friend. So, I mean, this is an answer to your question about Judith. There's a lot of particular personal details about her that I've fictionalized and that don't have a basis in the historical record, which is largely blank as far as Judith is concerned. But then there's these larger scale general cultural changes that were happening in the country in the middle of the 17th century, the time in which this novel is set, that are accurate. And in fact, even this character that she ends up re-encountering and going off with in London is a real historical figure. So I've made up a bunch of stuff about him too, but I also intermingled it with biographical fact. He was a player, he was a playwright, kind of a wild man in his own right. So she gets entangled with him, and there's other characters who form the kind of center of interest of the story in addition to her.
So while we don't have a lot of historical facts about Judith herself, it was a historical fact that women in Judith's position, whose life was perhaps fringed with the atypical and connected tangentially to medicine and herbal remedies, could, as a matter of complete historical accuracy, be accused of witchcraft, when running out of town might have been one way to handle that situation. So while Judith herself can't be proven to have taken these actions, it definitely fits within a narrative based in her real life time period. Now, Judith was quite old when she died at the age of 77. And surprisingly, her husband dies in the same year that she does, which I just think is ironic on a lot of levels. But tell us, Grace, how did Judith die and in real life? And how was her age compared to those around her? Was that an exceptional age for her to have reached for this time period?
Well, we don't know how she died. It was definitely a ripe old age, particularly for the 17th century, but not tremendously unusual. Amelia Lanier, who a 17th century poet who some people have linked with Shakespeare. I actually read another novel about her, that she is believed by some to have been the dark lady of Shakespeare's sonnets, and she lived to be 76. So that's not that much difference. Galileo lived to be 78. I mean, there were always people who were living on into their 70s, and even Michelangelo, well, that's a century earlier, but he lived to be 89. The thing that brought the average lifespan down so much was just this huge proportion of births that were stillbirths. I mean, there was just large-scale infant mortality, death in childhood, as well as many, many things that we now have antibiotics to cure that weren't around to cure people. So, lots of things that could kill you off before your time. But there were always people who lived on into their 70s and 80s. And I think it is a good old age to have reached for this time period. What is particularly unusual for as length of life was in the Shakespeare family, because not a lot of them lived that long. I mean, Shakespeare, we always think of him as an old guy when he died. He was 52 years old when he died. Judith's mother was in her 60s, kind of mid 60s. She outlived her children. So many of the children died either in childhood or in two of her three sons died as young men. So I think that's the thing that makes her kind of outlier, is, partly for her time period, but definitely for her own family as being kind of the last one standing. That's intriguing, not just for that domestic fact, but also for the time period that she lived through. So she was born in the 16th century during the age of Elizabeth. She lived on through the Caroline age, or the Jacobean age, the age of James I, the Caroline age, the age of King Charles, through the English Civil War, and then on into the Restoration. And if you think of the different cultural changes that took place, Civil War, the execution of a king, the reinstallment of a king, very different kind of allocation of powers among king and parliament by the time the Restoration occurred, or as part of the Restoration. And that's another thing that makes her an intriguing historical figure, just, the changes that she witnessed, that she lived through. Yeah, it'd be great to talk to her, to conjure her up and talk to her. So that's what I tried to do.
Judith's grave is either not located in Holy Trinity Church, or if it's there, it remains unmarked. And if she was successful as an adult with a reasonable place in society, why does she not have a known grave? Is the lack of a grave in Stratford one reason you were inspired to have her fictionalized character leave the city? Do you believe it was possible that the actual Judith left her hometown?
I actually didn't even know about that until you brought that up. And so I have to say it wasn't. And she does, well, I don't want to give the ending of the story away, so I won't say what happens to her after
Yeah, no
she
spoilers.
leaves. Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, it's unknown. I mean, I will just say that, people tend to focus on, because we're so fascinated with Shakespeare, then limited amounts of information, which can even include, births and dates on gravestones, or whether there even is one, those become of such importance to people. And if something is missing, it's like, well, it's intriguing that this is missing, and it is. But the fact is, this is 400 years ago, and records disappear. And no matter who you are, there's a very limited number of people of whom there's enough of a written record that we can form a full account of their life or of their family's life. It's just that for most families, we're not trying to do that because we're not as interested in them as we are in Shakespeare. So we look at Shakespeare, we look at, we want to find out what happened to his family. We want to know about Judith. She doesn't have a gravestone. It may be significant that she doesn't, but it's also a fact that there are other members of Shakespeare's family that were undoubtedly respectable Stratford citizens and beloved members of the family. And we can't find their gravestones either. We can't find Hamnet's gravestone, Shakespeare's son, who was undoubtedly very important to him and is apparently buried in Holy Trinity Churchyard, but we don't know exactly where either. So I would assume that Judith Shakespeare is there and that she had a gravestone. And gravestones don't last forever. I mean, 400 years. It's like George Herbert wrote in this famous poem, Church Monuments. He talks about the fellowship of dust, where even the gravestones start crumbling to dust, and they fall down and they meet the earth and they meet the dust of the bodies. That's probably what happened with Judith. And it's possible that she ended up living her life someplace else apart from Stratford. The slim record that we have indicates that she lived and died there and that she was buried with her family, and we just don't know exactly where.
Your story definitely inspires us to want to dig deeper into the real life of Judith Shakespeare, because your fictional version of a pretend timeline for her is so interesting. I know we would love to explore her life and definitely your books that much further. Tell us where to find your books on Judith Quiney, as well as point us towards some of the resources you relied upon when putting together your novels that you would recommend we check out if we want to learn more about the life of Judith Quiney.
Well, again, there's two Judiths, right? There's the blank, right? The blank one, the historical Judith, about whom we know very, very little, but you can find out as much as there is to know. If you're looking for a biography, a biographical account, then there are some excellent biographies of Shakespeare. And the one that I found most helpful was Russell Fraser. He's got a 2-part biography of Shakespeare. The first part is called Young Shakespeare, and the second part is called Shakespeare, the Later Years. And so all the information that we have about Judith, which, as I said, is slim, he tells it in a very, he's got a very engaging style. So he talks about Shakespeare and the rest of his family. So I would recommend that. As far as my fictionalized, weirdo, crazy, wild, eccentric Judith, my first novel about her, which deals with her childhood and her young womanhood, is called My Father Had a Daughter, and it's out there. It was published by Berkeley in 2003. Those who are interested in reading about my fictional version of Shakespeare's daughter in this later stage of her life, in her 60s, that's what I address and represent in The Owl Was a Baker's Daughter. As far as sources to inform about the cultural context, the historical situation in which her adventures occur, there's a couple of books I'd recommend. One is a book by the historian Christopher Hill called God's Englishman, which is about the English Civil War. And the Englishman in question is Oliver Cromwell, the Protestant general. And it focuses on not just military events, but just the cultural changes that were occurring in English at this time. Anything you can read about the closing of the theaters during this mid-century period in English history, because that's one of the things that the Puritan Parliament affected, was a kind of shutdown on what they considered immoral public entertainments, or public entertainments that had the wrong kind of politics. And so this has a direct effect on Shakespeare's dead by this time, but on his legacy and even in the way that his plays and to a certain extent his family are regarded as, somewhat dangerous to be known or plays to be performed. So anything about those theater closings, there's a wonderful article by Gabriel Egan, Egan, called The Closure of the Theaters, which talks about that. I guess those are 3 or 4 sources I'd recommend, a mixture of the historical and the biographical and the fictional.
These are wonderful resources, absolutely. And Grace visited with us to talk about her first novel, My Father Had a Daughter, on a previous episode of That Shakespeare Life. So we'll link you to that, as well as provide details on these resources she shared here today. So you can check out her new book, as well as look through some of the historical references, so you can be armed with the history when you go and enjoy her version of Judith Quiney's life and what might have happened to her. We will put all of these in the show notes for today's episode. So definitely, if you're listening where you can't jot down the titles and authors right away, you can check out the show notes for this week to find that information and direct links to all of them. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Grace, as you know, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, it had to be a really long book because I don't know how long I'm going to be there. I need to read something slowly. So I'm thinking maybe Don Quixote in the original early modern Spanish. That'll take me forever. Parts 1 and 2. So that's what I'll bring.
That should do you for quite a while.
Yeah. It'll take me a couple years.
Yes, that one to me is up there with War and Peace in terms of it being meaty to get through. Worth it for sure, but a meaty selection. So I think if you're going to be stuck on a deserted island, that makes a practical choice for that situation. So what's next for you? You've completed this second book on Judith Quiney. What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, there's several things. I'm trying to do more translation. I'm interested in translating fiction from the Spanish, and I've translated a novel by the Mexican author Maria Luisa Puga, who has never been translated into English before, although she's an award-winning Mexican author. So I'm trying to get that published and looking for more projects of that kind. I also am revising a novel that is set during the 20th century, partly in London in the 1950s and partly in Russia in the 1930s during the Stalinist purges of that time, with characters based loosely on real historical figures, including some scientists who suffered persecution in the 1930s. And so that's called a human science. And it's not in publication yet. I'm revising it and working on it. But eventually I will be writing a third novel in this Judith series to make it a trilogy. And we get to see what she thought of the Restoration, because she lived on into the early years of the Restoration, as we've said. But also the focus of that novel will be the child, the strange child, who is an important character in the current novel. Now grown up, and where else should she be? She's on the Restoration stage. The theaters have reopened, and now women can perform on stage. This novel is going to focus on that young character who is introduced in this current novel that's about Judith.
We will look forward to hearing about your new work moving forward. I'm very excited to see where you take Judith for her final novel of this trilogy. Grace, Tiffany, we thank you so much for joining us today to celebrate the life of Judith Shakespeare Quiney and inspiring us to explore her history that much further. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. It's fun.
Our podcast episode is equipped with a show notes page that allows you to find direct links to our guest today, her resources, and all of the recommended reading she provided if you'd like to learn more about the life of Judith Quiney, as well as see some of the things that she based her historical fiction book upon. You can find all of these organized neatly for you in the show notes for today's episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 361. That's CassidyCash.com/EP361. If you love the history you learn about here on the show and you'd like to go one step further to try out some of the history we talk about here on the podcast, then you will love Experience Shakespeare. Experience Shakespeare is our Patreon tier designed to let you try out games, recipes, and crafts straight from the life of William Shakespeare, all of which you can complete at home or in your classroom with items you may already have on hand or can easily source from your local market or store. Each of our hands-on activity kits provides step-by-step instructions for how to complete the activity, along with a video tutorial and a bonus history guide that shows you how the activity coordinates not only with Shakespeare's plays, but specific episodes of our podcast. Find out more and dive in with your first hands-on activity at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and click on Experience Shakespeare. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.